Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Rose and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chawla, and as always, I'm joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. Lots going on in the world, as always, but this time we're talking about the protests in China and what they remind us about autocratic regimes being subject to public approval. Brunello, in the last few days, we've heard about all this news about protests taking place in China, which might sound a little bit eerie, given that that's not something we'd usually expect for an autocratic country. Could you give us a bit of a bird's eye view on where this is happening and what the scale of this is so far?
These protests are taking place in many cities of China and is mostly related to the zero COVID policy that has been implemented by the government, which is considered to be particularly harsh by citizens of China in those cities. So it's somehow a nationwide protest on a nationwide issue, which is kind of a novelty, if you wish, for China, whereby protests have taken place as in the past, but mostly on local issues against, if you want, the authorities of the local government. Somehow, protesting against the local government has been tolerated in the last few years. I wouldn't say is allowed or admitted, but at least it's tolerated. But protests on a national issue against the national government and the Chinese Communist Party itself is kind of new for China, and clearly that has not gone down well with the central government.
You know, anytime we talk about protests and civil unrest in relationship with China, the memories of Tiananmen Square always come about. I'm wondering if this is in any way similar to that, sort of even a beginning of that, or if, the CCP, you can see them in the near future offering any concessions to the protesters and fundamentally perhaps reshaping their own zero COVID policy.
So clearly, when there are big protests in China, memory goes back to the Tiananmen episode. And this doesn't seem something that would get to that kind of scale, also because the government seems to have listened sooner than in that occasion. At that point, there was the real quest for, if you want, a more liberal or less autocratic society. At the time in which there was a political shift in China. This is a protest against a specific issue. Although clearly, as it always happens, you take the cue from one specific issue and then you tend to start protesting against the entire organization of the state, which is the reason why the government needs to tame these protests and these movements before they become too large, which is the reason why they seem to have listened, and literally a few days later, some of these restrictions have been lifted. Again, I would say unofficially and at local level. This is not a change in policy by the Politburo, by the Standing Committee. That would be a volte-face that would not be considered acceptable. Kind of a U-turn in policy that doesn't look nice, especially for a newly elected leader. But it seems like at local level, cities have been authorized to lift some of the bans and lift some of those restrictions, and this kind of is giving some breathing space to the population of those cities. So, is not a policy change per se, but is a policy shift from zero COVID, so 0 cases, to 0 mortality, which is also impossible. 0 cases is impossible given the nature of the virus, how easily spread it can be, but even 0 mortality, also because you would need to define who dies for COVID or other disease, associated disease, and so on and so on. We went through the entire pandemic having this kind of discussions on excess mortality and so, and the causes of death and so on and so forth. So both 0 COVID and 0 mortality seems impossible goals, but at least the latter is less impossible than the former.
Sure. And it sort of this comes, at a kind of broader geopolitical slash macroeconomic landscape where China is sort of almost slowly kind of decoupling from the West, whether that's financially, that's technologically, maybe that's economically. But also, insofar as COVID is concerned, we've seen the development of two completely different vaccine regimes. In light of that, what do you think China should learn from this? What do you think it should do? And what lessons can we take away more broadly for autocratic regimes in general?
So there's a very easy policy that China should adopt, and is start importing the vaccines of the West that have proven way more successful than the Sinovacs, which wasn't a good one, especially those based on modified RNA, which has been the real revolution for this pandemic. Some other vaccines, such as the AstraZeneca, that were based on traditional technology, still work pretty well. Don't get me wrong, in providing some level of immunization. But clearly, those who surprised, so to speak, the world were the mRNA-based vaccines that have been extremely effective, produced quickly on a large scale, and easily adaptable to a changing virus. Will China do that? No, for sure not. It will again lose face, given the inability of producing anything of that quality, which will reveal a sort of technological, I would say, delay on the part of China of responding to the COVID. Let's not forget, it's a pandemic that started in China. So clearly is a very embarrassing situation for the central government. But nonetheless, it would be very hard for China to do so. So either they start producing their own vaccines, or they should accept that COVID will have to, so the population will have to coexist with COVID for some time, or they will eventually give in and start importing the vaccines from the West. Wider geopolitical implications, or you say implications regarding autocratic regimes. Well, this episode reminds us that even autocratic regimes cannot govern without some form of public support. We have said, I think, in several occasions that democracies always seem very wobbly. It's like continuously fragmented type of political landscape, and it's on the verge of collapsing, but then it never collapses because it self-adapts to, in changing times effectively, and costumes and people's preferences and so on. Not always in the right direction. We know that we have gone several times in history from a democratic regime to an autocratic regime. We know that. So not necessarily the majority of people makes the best decision for society. But autocratic regimes have this characteristic of seeming extremely stable, never a crack, impossible to collapse, destined to stay there forever until suddenly they collapse and they are not there anymore. And there's a revolution, there's a regime change, there's something that wasn't there the day before. So the lessons of this episode shows that even when you are an autocratic regime and you might want to keep everything as stable as possible, perhaps by suppressing those protests with violence potentially, even in that case, you still need some form of public support, because eventually the entire population is bigger than any combination of governmental forces, is even bigger than the army and the police that you can deploy, because eventually the army and the police cannot kill the entire population just to repress the protest. So if the protest is uncontrollable, eventually the revolution ensues. I mean, we may believe that this regime that we see these days are kind of particularly scary, if you want, and so on. But in the past, during the Ancien regime and so on, people have revolted against much more severe autocracies or dictatorships, and yet they eventually fell. So all these lessons from the past have been learned, by the autocratic regimes, and they know that they need to listen to what the population says.
Of course, so basically a fundamental kind of almost revisiting, in some sense, autocratic regimes uh, have a tendency to fall after a period of such stability. When there are cracks in the system, they're just much harder to see because there isn't an official democratic process. Yet, of course, they still rely on public approval, as China's example is now increasingly showing. Brunel, thank you so much for your thoughts and insights.
Thank you very much.